Martijn Wilder is our next speaker. Martijn has honours degrees in economics and law from the Universities of Sydney and Australian National University, was a Cambridge Commonwealth Trust Scholar and has published widely in the international law and climate change area. Martijn holds innumerable critical key roles, of which I'll just give you a flavour. He's chair of the New South Wales Climate Change Council and chair of the New South Wales Government Carbon Trading Hub Task Force. He's also on the governing board of the UK government's Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership. He's a governor of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and he is a founder of and on the advisory board of the Renewable Energy and International Law Project. Now, currently, Martijn heads Baker & McKenzie's Global Climate Change and Emissions Trading Practice, and he's also an adjunct professor of climate change law and policy at ANU. He advises governments, international agencies, including the United Nations Development and Environment Programmes, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, on the development and the implementation of climate change and emission trading policies and programs. He also works with an international client base on international carbon transactions on a daily basis. So from the coalface, as it were, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Martijn to provide us with a different perspective on tonight's topic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I think, rather than necessarily a different perspective, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what's been spoken about already, and to give you some sort of, real life, some further real life examples of projects. When thinking about the topic tonight, I guess the starting point of what was advertised was carbon trading exposed. So I guess the first thing that sort of made me think was, well, there's automatically an assumption that carbon trading itself, that there's a problem with carbon trading, that there's something here which needs to be revealed. But I think the real objective of tonight is to talk a little bit about whether or not the direction in which the world is heading in terms of developing emissions trading schemes as the primary response to climate change is really the most appropriate way to go. And in this sense, the development of legal regimes that regulate emissions have a direct impact on the world in the sense that, and on the poor in the sense that if we don't get it right, that will have a fundamental consequence for global climate change and we won't be able to solve the problem. It also is important because the tools in which we use to design those schemes, we've heard about the Clean Development Mechanism, which I'll come back to in a moment, are key tools through which those systems engage with the world's poor and developing countries. So what I'm going to do tonight is just sort of put this in a little bit more perspective and just talk a little bit more about some of the projects and why carbon trading does have an important role to play, but why also if we don't get it right, then there will be serious consequences. So the first point I really just want to make is that climate change is very much a global issue. It has global effects and really needs to be dealt with at a global level. For many years now, we've had an international process through the United Nations to try to deal with climate change. That process has been done through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where all governments around the world came together to agree to take action on climate change. But it was through further negotiation that we had further agreements like a famous agreement called the Kyoto Protocol, which is an international agreement that sets targets and sets measures to actually deal with climate change. Within these international legal frameworks, the key ways that are laid out to deal with the problem of climate change are: one, reducing emissions through targets, so setting targets on countries to reduce their emissions, through having domestic measures in countries and through other governments helping to fund those measures in developing countries, through transferring technology, and this is a big issue that continues to be debated. If the world's developed countries have a lot of technology that can solve the problem, then that technology should be transferred to developing countries, and that's an issue that will continue to be discussed in the negotiations going forward. And also the use of market mechanisms. So what's the best mechanisms that we can put in place on the private sector who are actually causing the emissions to cause them to reduce those emissions? And the key tool that has been adopted within these international frameworks is in fact emissions trading. And within that framework, a small part of that which engages the developed countries with the developing countries is what's called the Clean Development Mechanism. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The other two measures are through adopting measures that relate to mitigation. We accept that there are already impacts of climate change that can't be avoided, so what are the measures in those international agreements to mitigate climate change impacts? And then finally, adaptation. How do we adapt to climate change, particularly as we know there are many areas where there are unavoidable consequences which will occur because of the emissions we've already put into the atmosphere. Emissions trading, in this sense, I'm not going to go through this slide in great detail, but it's just to demonstrate that we have a very complex array of international law mechanisms between governments that regulate emissions trading, and then within that, every country are developing different emission trading schemes. So, as many of you know, one of the key pieces of legislation before the Australian Senate at the moment is our CPRS bill, our emissions trading scheme, but we are one of the last countries to come to the table with an emissions trading scheme. 30 countries in Europe at the moment trade under the European emissions trading scheme. The American emission trading bill is expected to go into their House of Reps in the next 12 days. And so what we're doing here is we're setting up not just a global system of emissions trading, but also domestic schemes within developed countries. Now, the key link, again, to developing countries is this ability to do projects in developing countries that reduce emissions. Now, the basic principle here, which we've heard from my fellow speakers, is that if you reduce a tonne of carbon through doing a project in a developing country, that tonne of carbon gives you a carbon credit. So when we talk about carbon credits and pricing, for every tonne of emissions that you bring down through a project in a developing country, you basically get a tonne of carbon. And developed country companies will buy that carbon because they have a legal obligation under their domestic trading scheme to buy permits. So that's really how the principle works. And there's a very active global market to buy this carbon at the moment. It's trading at present, and the international CDM carbon is trading, the price has gone down, but at the moment it's around between 10 and 12 euro a tonne.